The morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the land slowly, as if even the sun hesitated to look too closely at what waited below. A pale gray light stretched across the horizon, thin and uncertain, touching the tops of the trees before sliding down toward the fields. The air was cool, damp with night mist, and carried the sour, sweet smell of soil that had been worked too hard for too many years. Betsy was already awake when the first rooster cried. She always was. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and fragile, easily broken by memory, by pain, by the simple knowledge that dawn meant work and work meant survival. Her feet found the ground before her eyes fully opened. The earth was cold, uneven, familiar. She did not rush. There was no need. Time belonged to others, not to her. She tied the worn cloth around her head, smoothing it down with hands roughened by years of labor. Her fingers moved from habit, not thought. Every motion had been learned, corrected, and beaten into precision long ago. A mistake, even a small one, could be noticed. Being noticed was dangerous. The sky lightened as she stepped outside the cabin. Around her, other doors creaked open one by one, releasing figures shaped by shadow and fatigue. No one spoke. Words before sunrise felt risky, as if sound itself might draw attention. Instead, there were small noises, the shuffle of bare feet, a cough quickly stifled, the soft thud of a bucket being lifted. Betsy breathed in through her nose, steady and controlled. The air tasted of wood smoke from dying embers and of something else, old fear that never quite left the place. She walked toward the fields with the others, head lowered, eyes fixed on the path ahead. Dew clung to the grass, soaking the hem of her dress. Cold wetness crept up her ankles, but she did not flinch. Flinching could be seen. The land stretched wide and flat, rows already marked, already waiting. It did not matter how much had been taken from it the day before. The earth was expected to give again and again and again. The sun finally broke free of the horizon, spilling dull gold across the fields. It should have been beautiful. Betsy knew that, somewhere deep inside her, there was a part that could still recognize beauty, but beauty required distance, and there was no distance here, only closeness, only weight. The light revealed everything it touched, bent backs, tired faces, hands already stained before the day truly began. A voice cut through the quiet, sharp, commanding. The overseer's voice always sounded louder in the morning, as if it fed on the stillness. Betsy felt it before she heard his boots, the way the muscles in her shoulders tightened on their own. The sound followed soon after, leather striking earth, deliberate, unhurried. He liked to be heard. He liked the way people straightened when he approached, the way silence deepened around him. Betsy lowered her head further as he passed behind her. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She had learned how to disappear while standing in plain sight. Her back curved just enough, her movements careful and efficient. She reached down and worked the soil, fingers pressing, pulling, repeating the same motion she had performed thousands of times before. The rhythm was almost comforting, a small island of predictability in a world where unpredictability often meant pain. The overseer stopped nearby. She could tell by the way the air shifted, by the pause in his steps. She did not look up. Looking up could be taken as defiance, or worse, invitation. Her eyes remained on the ground, tracing cracks in the soil, tiny stones, the imprint of another's foot. The earth held stories too, if you knew how to read them, stories of exhaustion, of endless cycles, of hands that shaped it without ever owning it. He spoke again, addressing the group, reminding them of quotas, of punishment, of what happened when expectations were not met. His words were practiced, polished by repetition. Betsy did not listen to the meaning anymore. She listened only for changes in tone, for the signs that his attention might shift toward her. None came. His boots moved on. As the sun climbed higher, heat began to replace the chill. Sweat formed at the base of Betsy's neck, trickling slowly down her spine. The work grew heavier with each passing hour, though the tasks remained the same. Bend, pull, straighten, dip, repeat. Her body knew the sequence better than her mind did. Pain existed, but it had become a distant companion, something acknowledged but not engaged with. Engaging with pain made it stronger. Around her, the field filled with quiet effort. Occasionally, a soft hum escaped someone's lips, quickly swallowed. Music was dangerous too, but silence could be suffocating. Betsy kept her mouth closed. She had learned that her thoughts were safer than her voice. She remembered other mornings years earlier, when dawn had felt different, when she had been smaller, lighter, not yet fully aware of how the world worked. There had been a time when the field was simply a place, not a sentence. Those memories came uninvited, slipping through cracks in her focus. She pushed them aside. Memory was a double-edged thing. It kept her human, but it also cut deep. The overseer made his rounds again, closer this time. Betsy felt the shadow before it fell over her hands. The smell of him reached her sweat, tobacco, something sharp and sour. Her stomach tightened. She focused harder on her work, increasing her pace just enough to signal diligence without drawing attention. Her hands moved faster, though her muscles protested. Protest, like flinching, was not allowed. "Careful," he said, voice low, directed at someone nearby. A warning, not yet a threat. Betsy did not turn her head. She could hear the shallow breathing of the person beside her, the fear vibrating through the air like heat off the ground. Fear was contagious. She guarded herself against it, building walls inside her mind. Time stretched. The sun climbed, shadows shortened. Betsy worked. She counted rows instead of minutes, plants instead of hours. Numbers were easier than time. Time implied an end. She had learned not to expect endings. When the brief pause came, barely long enough to swallow water, she sat back on her heels and stared at the horizon. The line where sky met land looked impossibly far away. Freedom, she had once thought, must live somewhere beyond that line. Now she knew better. Freedom was not a place you reached by walking. It was something else entirely, something harder, something dangerous to imagine. As the overseer shouted again, urging them back to work, Betsy rose without complaint. Her body obeyed before her mind could question it. She returned to the rhythm, to the soil, to the silence. But beneath that silence, something else stirred. Not hope. Hope was too fragile. Not anger. Anger burned too fast. It was something quieter, heavier, a knowing. A patience shaped by years of watching, of listening, of enduring. The dawn had passed. The day had begun, and Betsy, like the field beneath her hands, absorbed everything without showing a single crack. The scars were always there, even when she tried not to think about them. They lived beneath the thin cotton of her dress, beneath skin that had healed just enough to keep her alive, but never enough to let her forget. Betsy felt them most in the quiet moments when the wind shifted just right, when sweat dried too quickly, when sleep drifted near and memory followed close behind. Pain had a way of waiting patiently, like it knew it would always be invited back. She remembered the first scar clearly, though she had been young enough then to believe pain had an end. She had cried that day, not from the blow itself, but from the shock of it, from the sudden understanding that adults could choose cruelty and call it order. That scar had taught her fear. The others came later and taught her something else entirely. By the time the scars multiplied, she had learned not to scream. Screams fed them. Silence, she discovered, unsettled them far more. Silence made them work harder, made them angry. Anger was dangerous, but it was also predictable. Predictability could be studied. Betsy studied everything. The smokehouse was where the worst lessons lived. Even thinking the word made her chest tighten. It was a squat, ugly building at the edge of the plantation, its wood darkened by years of smoke and grease. Meat was hung there to dry, to preserve, to be kept for later use. That was what it was meant for. That was what they said it was for. But Betsy learned early that buildings, like people, were often used for things they were never meant to hold. The first time she was taken there, she did not understand why. Confusion softened the fear at first, dulled it just enough to make the shock sharper when it came. The door had closed behind her with a sound too final to ignore. The air inside was thick and stale, heavy with old smoke that clung to her throat the moment she breathed in. Hooks hung from the beams overhead, swaying slightly, as if the building itself was restless. She remembered how her eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, how shapes emerged one by one. She remembered the heat beginning as a promise, then turning into a threat. She remembered the overseer. His voice calm, instructional, almost bored. That memory cut deeper than any lash ever had. Violence delivered with anger could be understood. Violence delivered without feeling was something else entirely. She did not remember how long it lasted. Time dissolved in that place. There was only sensation, heat crawling across her skin, smoke filling her lungs, pain blooming and blooming again. She had tried to count breaths, then heartbeats, then nothing at all. When she was finally dragged out, the morning light had hurt her eyes worse than the fire had hurt her skin. After that, the smokehouse never left her, even when she stood in open air, even when the sky stretched wide and blue above her. Part of her was still inside that dark wooden box, listening to the crackle of fire and the sound of her own breathing turning desperate. The scars on her back were proof that memory could be written into flesh. Others saw the scars sometimes. They pretended not to. It was safer that way. Pity was dangerous, sympathy even more so. Betsy did not blame them. Everyone there was trying to survive, and survival left little room for shared grief. Pain was personal currency. You spent it quietly or not at all. As the years passed, the scars thickened. Some faded into pale lines. Others remained raised and angry, sensitive to touch, to cold, to heat. She learned which movements pulled at them, which ones eased the tightness. Her body became a map she navigated daily, avoiding certain roads, enduring others because there was no alternative. But scars were not only on her back. They lived behind her eyes, in the way she watched people, in the way she listened more than she spoke. She learned to recognize the sound of a mood shifting, the way a voice hardened just before punishment followed. She learned that cruelty often arrived wearing familiarity, that the most dangerous moments were the quiet ones when no one seemed angry at all. The overseer changed over the years, but the role did not. Different faces, same boots, same voice sharpened by authority. They all believed the same thing, that fear was a tool, and pain was a language everyone understood. Betsy understood it better than most. She understood that pain could teach obedience, but it could also teach patience. And patience, unlike fear, did not fade with time. At night, when the quarters finally fell quiet, Betsy lay awake and traced the scars in her mind. She did not touch them. Touching made them too real, too immediate. Instead, she remembered how each one came to be what mistake, real or imagined, had justified it. She replayed those moments not to relive the pain, but to study it. To understand the rules of the world she lived in, written not on paper, but on bodies like hers. She realized something slowly, over years rather than days. The scars were meant to break her, to remind her of her place, to turn her inward until there was nothing left but obedience. But they had failed in one crucial way. They had taught her how far cruelty could go, and once you know that, once you truly understand the worst that can be done to you, fear loses some of its power. This realization did not come with triumph or relief. It came quietly, one night, as she lay listening to someone else cry softly in their sleep. Betsy stared up at the darkness and felt a familiar ache along her spine. She thought of the smokehouse, of the heat, of the door closing, and she understood that nothing they could do to her now would be new. Everything had already been shown to her. Justice, she knew, was not something designed for people like her. Justice lived in books she could not read, in courts she would never see, spoken in voices that did not sound like hers. Waiting for it was a kind of slow death. Accepting its absence was another. What remained was something harder to name. Not revenge exactly. Revenge burned too hot too quickly. It blinded. Betsy needed clarity. What grew inside her instead was resolve, cold, steady, patient. It did not demand immediate action. It simply refused to disappear. The overseer passed her one afternoon and glanced at her back as the wind shifted her dress. His eyes lingered, not with concern, but with appraisal, as if the scars were inventory, proof of work done. Betsy felt the gaze like a hand pressing against old wounds. She did not react. She did not slow. She did not flinch. Inside, something settled into place. That night, the smell of smoke drifted across the quarters as meat was prepared. It was faint, ordinary, something no one else seemed to notice. Betsy noticed. Her breath caught just for a moment before she forced it steady again. The smokehouse stood where it always had, silent, waiting. It had been a place of terror. It could be something else. She did not allow herself to think too far ahead. Thinking too far made things dangerous. Instead, she thought only of what she knew. Doors could be opened, and doors could be closed. Fire could destroy, but it could also reveal. Scars marked what had been done, but they also marked survival. When sleep finally came, it brought no peace, but it brought clarity. Betsy dreamed of heat and darkness, but this time she was standing, not bound, not helpless. This time she was the one watching the door. The scars ached when she woke, as they often did. She took it as a reminder, not a warning. They were not just wounds anymore. They were records, and records, she understood, could be answered. Betsy did not begin with a plan. Plans required certainty, and certainty was a luxury she had never known. What she had instead was attention, sharp, disciplined, patient attention honed by years of necessity. She watched because watching kept her alive. She listened because listening revealed truths people thought were hidden. Over time, attention became something else, a quiet instrument, finely tuned, capable of catching patterns others missed. She learned the overseer as habits, the way one learns the weather, not by trusting a single sign, but by noticing the small things that repeated. The way his shoulders loosened after his second drink. The way his temper flared quicker when the sun was high and the work lagged. The hours he favored for making his rounds, and the hours he avoided. She learned when he was most cruel, and when he was most careless. Carelessness, she understood, was more useful than cruelty. The days blurred together, but the rhythms did not change. Morning counts, midday inspections, evening threats delivered with a tired voice that still carried authority. Betsy placed herself where she could see without being seen. She worked steadily, never the fastest, never the slowest. Extremes attracted attention. She lived in the narrow middle, where people faded into the background. She noticed how often the overseer lingered near the smokehouse. It was his domain in a way the fields were not. The fields belonged to the landowners, to the system, to generations of enforced labor. The smokehouse felt more personal. It was where he stored what he controlled, where order was preserved through heat and time. He checked it often, not because it needed checking, but because it reminded him of his power. Betsy also noticed when others were sent away from that part of the land. There were days when whole crews were moved to distant fields, leaving only a handful behind. On those days, the air around the smokehouse felt heavier, quieter. She filed that knowledge away, not as opportunity yet, but as possibility. Weeks passed, then months. Betsy let them. Time was her ally now, not her enemy. She did not rush her thoughts or force them into shape. She allowed them to grow naturally, like roots finding cracks in stone. Every detail she gathered was placed carefully in her mind, connected to others, forming something that still did not have a name. She learned about rats first from listening, not from seeing. Complaints muttered between workers, curses spoken under breath when food stores ran low. Rats were blamed for many things: missing grain, spoiled meat, torn sacks. They were a convenient enemy because they could not speak back. Betsy noticed how quickly the overseer reacted to any mention of them. The idea of loss of waste angered him more than human suffering ever did. She tested this knowledge quietly. One evening, as they worked near the outbuildings, she mentioned seeing movement near the smokehouse to another woman, keeping her voice low, casual. The woman frowned, said nothing, but the words traveled the way words always did. By the next day, the overseer was inspecting the area, cursing loudly, threatening punishment if anything had been damaged. Betsy said nothing. She watched. The overseer's fear of appearing negligent was as strong as his desire to control. Betsy understood that now. His authority depended not just on violence, but on the appearance of order. Anything that suggested disorder, spoilage, infestation, neglect was an insult to him. She waited again. Patience, she had learned, was not passive. It was active restraint, a constant choosing not to move too soon. She continued to observe his moods, his routines, his blind spots. She noticed that when he drank, his pride swelled. He laughed louder, he listened less, he believed himself untouchable. There came a day when the sun burned hotter than usual, when tempers across the plantation ran thin. The overseer drank earlier than normal. Betsy saw the bottle pass his lips, saw the slight wobble in his step as he walked. She felt something shift inside her, not urgency but readiness. She did not approach him directly. That would have been too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, she allowed herself to be nearby, visible enough to be noticed, unremarkable enough not to raise suspicion. When he spoke to her, it was with irritation, as if she were an object that had failed to stay in its place. She answered carefully, eyes lowered, voice steady. She mentioned the smokehouse, almost as an afterthought. Said she had smelled something off. Said it might be nothing. Said she worried about rats. She framed it as concern for his property, his reputation. She offered the problem, not a challenge. He laughed. Dismissive at first. Rats were everywhere, he said. Women imagined things. But the word lingered. She could see it in the way his eyes narrowed just slightly, in the way his gaze drifted toward the building in question. Betsy did not press. Pressing would have been a mistake. Later that day, he called for someone to accompany him to the smokehouse. Betsy did not volunteer. Volunteers were remembered. She waited until he pointed, until his finger landed on her without much thought behind it. She bowed her head and followed. The walk there felt longer than usual, though the distance had not changed. Betsy kept her steps measured, her breathing calm. Inside, her thoughts moved quickly, but she kept them contained, like water behind a dam. The closer they got, the stronger the smell became, not of rot, but of old smoke and grease, familiar and unwelcome. The overseer complained as they walked, muttering about waste, about incompetence, about how everything fell apart if he did not watch it himself. Betsy listened, offering small sounds of agreement when appropriate. She made herself useful by being silent. At the door, he hesitated only a moment before pulling it open. The interior was dim, cool compared to the heat outside. He stepped in first, peering around, poking at hanging hooks and beams. Betsy stayed near the entrance, just inside the threshold. From there, she could see everything. He bent down, inspecting the floor, grumbling about droppings that might or might not have been there. He called her stupid for worrying, then demanded she bring a torch closer so he could see. She did, holding it steady, her hands betraying nothing. This was not the moment. She knew that with absolute certainty. This was rehearsal, not performance. She observed how the door swung, how the latch caught, how long it took for him to move from one side of the room to the other. She stored every detail away. When they left, he seemed almost disappointed that nothing was wrong. Betsy hid her relief behind her lowered gaze. Relief was dangerous too. After that day, the idea took clearer shape, not as a single decision, but as an alignment of many small truths. The smokehouse was isolated. The overseer's pride made him reckless, his fear of disorder made him predictable. And Betsy had learned how to be invisible until invisibility was no longer needed. She waited for the right combination of circumstances, a day when the others were sent far into the fields, when the overseer drank, when his temper softened into arrogance. She did not mark the days on any calendar. She marked them in her body, in the tightening and loosening of something deep inside her chest. At night she lay awake, not dreaming, not planning in words, but imagining movements. The turn of a wrist, the weight of a door, the sound of a lock sliding into place. She imagined it over and over, not to excite herself, but to remove surprise from the equation. Surprise was the enemy of control. There were moments when doubt crept in, thin and sharp, moments when she wondered if patience had turned into hesitation, if resolve would fail her when it mattered. In those moments, memory answered. The smokehouse answered. The scars answered. Doubt did not last long when fed with truth. She began to speak more often of rats, of spoilage, always softly, always indirectly. The idea grew in the overseer's mind, nourished by his own fears and pride. He began checking the smokehouse more frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes dragging someone along. Betsy noticed when he stopped bringing others. She noticed when he trusted his authority enough to believe he did not need witnesses. The day arrived without announcement. The air felt heavy, charged. The sun pressed down hard, and the fields shimmered. Betsy knew before anything happened. Her body knew. There was a steadiness in her that surprised even her. When the overseer called for her again, his voice was loose, careless. He joked as they walked, laughed at his own words. Betsy responded when necessary, silent when not. The smokehouse door loomed ahead, dark against the light. Inside the building waited unchanged wood, hooks, shadows. Betsy stepped in behind him just as she had before. Her heart beat steadily, not fast, not slow. She had waited too long to let fear rush her now. As he moved deeper inside, complaining, cursing, distracted by his own voice, Betsy took one small step back. Her hand found the latch without searching. The metal was cool beneath her fingers. Solid, real. This time she did not imagine the movement. She did not rehearse it. She simply did it. The sound the latch made was not loud. It was not the kind of sound that demanded attention or echoed dramatically through space. It was a small, practical noise, metal sliding into metal, final and precise. Yet to Betsy, it rang louder than any shout she had ever swallowed, louder than the crack of a whip, louder than the roaring fire she remembered too well. It was the sound of a decision completing itself. For a heartbeat, nothing else happened. The overseer was still turned away, bent slightly at the waist, poking at the far wall with a stick, muttering about waste and rot and fools who could do their jobs right. He did not notice the door behind him settle into place. He did not notice the sudden shift in the air, the way the room seemed to hold its breath. Betsy stood just inside the threshold, her hand still resting on the latch. The metal was cool against her palm, grounding her, anchoring her to the moment. She did not rush. Rushing was how mistakes were made. She let the seconds stretch, let certainty settle fully into her bones. When she stepped back, the floor creaked softly beneath her foot. That was when he turned. "What are you waiting for?" he snapped, irritation already sharpening his voice. Authority came to him easily, even in confusion, even in ignorance. Betsy did not answer. She reached behind her and pushed the door closed the rest of the way. Wood met wood with a dull thud. Still, he did not understand. Understanding took time, and time was something he had never imagined lacking. He frowned, eyes narrowing, irritation deepening into suspicion. "Open that," he said, not loudly but firmly, as one spoke to a disobedient animal. He took a step toward her. Betsy did not move forward. She moved back instead, out of reach, her body aligning instinctively with the door. Her hand returned to the latch, and this time she turned it. The click was unmistakable. The overseer stopped short. Confusion flickered across his face, brief and almost comical. Then his mouth twisted into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "It's not funny," he said. "Open it." Betsy met his gaze. It was the first time she had ever looked directly at him without lowering her eyes. The moment stretched thin between them, fragile and dangerous. In her chest, her heart beat steady, each thump deliberate, measured. Fear brushed against her, familiar as an old acquaintance, but it did not take hold. "I said open it," he repeated, louder now. She did not speak. Words would only weaken what had already been done. He took another step, then another, boots scraping against the floor. The space between them shrank. For an instant, instinct screamed at her to retreat, to apologize, to undo everything before it was too late. That instinct was old, deeply rooted, trained into her over years. She acknowledged it and ignored it. When he lunged, it was clumsy, fueled by anger and disbelief. Betsy moved sideways just enough to avoid his grasp. His hand closed on empty air, and he stumbled, swearing loudly. Rage flared now, bright and ugly. "You think this is a game?" he shouted. "You think you can?" His words cut off as Betsy slipped fully outside and pulled the door shut from her side. The heavy wood sealed him in, and this time there was no mistaking the meaning of it. He slammed into the door almost immediately, the impact shuddering through the frame. "Open this damn door," he roared. His fists struck again and again, the sound sharp and violent. The building seemed to tremble with his fury. Betsy stood there, just inches away, her forehead pressed briefly against the rough wood. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in prayer, not in regret, but in grounding. She listened. The pounding was real. The shouting was real. So was the door. So was the latch beneath her hand. She stepped back. Outside, the world continued as it always had. Birds called from the trees. Insects hummed in the heat. Somewhere far off, voices drifted from the fields, unaware, untouched. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, almost obscene. Inside the smokehouse, the overseer shouted again, this time not commands but threats. He promised punishment, promised death, promised things he had delivered to others without hesitation. Betsy heard them all and felt nothing new. Threats were old currency. They had lost their power the moment the door closed. She moved deliberately, gathering kindling, her hands steady despite the noise behind her. Each sound from inside struck something in her memory, echoes of her own past fear, her own trapped breaths, but they did not overwhelm her. She had lived those moments already. This was different. When she struck the flint, sparks jumped eagerly. Fire was honest. Fire did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. The first curl of smoke rose slowly, lazily, as if uncertain of its purpose. Betsy watched it, her eyes tracking its path upward as it slipped into the building through the gaps in the wood. She did not rush the fire. She fed it carefully, just enough to let it grow on its own terms. Inside, the overseer, as shouting shifted. Commands gave way to insults, then to something closer to panic. He pounded again, harder now, desperation lending strength to his blows. The door held. It had held before. It would hold again. Betsy stepped back and sat on an upturned crate, far enough to be safe, close enough to hear. The heat from the fire brushed against her skin, warm but not overwhelming. The smell of smoke filled the air, thick and familiar. Her stomach tightened briefly, memory clawing its way up her throat. She swallowed, forced herself to breathe slowly through her nose. This smoke was not her enemy. Inside, coughing joined the shouting. The rhythm of it was erratic. Panicked, Betsy closed her eyes again, not to shut it out, but to endure it. Each cough was an answer to a question asked years ago. Each gasp was a reflection of something she had once been forced to endure in silence. Time moved strangely. Seconds stretched long, then snapped back into minutes. Betsy measured it not by clocks, but by changes in sound. The pounding weakened. The shouting grew hoarse. Threats turned into pleas. "I'll let you go," he called, his voice cracking. "I swear it. Just open the door." She opened her eyes and stared at the smokehouse, at the dark stains on its walls, at the place that had once swallowed her screams without mercy. His words rolled over her without finding purchase. Promises were easy when power slipped away. She had heard enough of them to last a lifetime. The coughing grew worse. Silence followed, broken only by ragged breaths and the low crackle of fire. Betsy did not move. She did not approach the door. She did not speak. Intervention would only break the spell of inevitability that had settled over the moment. As the smoke thickened, the noises inside grew softer, less distinct. Betsy felt an unexpected heaviness settle in her chest, not guilt, not regret, but gravity. This was not triumph. It was consequence. There was a difference, and she felt it clearly. She thought of her scars, of the nights spent awake, tracing them in her mind. She thought of the heat, the darkness, the door that had once closed on her without hesitation. She thought of all the moments she had swallowed fear so completely it had become part of her. The fire burned steadily. Smoke continued its slow, patient work. Eventually the sound stopped. Betsy waited longer than she thought necessary. Waiting was a skill she had mastered. Only when the silence inside the smokehouse became absolute did she rise. She stood there looking at the door, at the latch that remained exactly where she had left it. She did not open it. Instead, she turned away. Her legs felt heavy as she walked back toward the fields, toward the life that had not yet caught up to what she had done. Each step felt both unreal and undeniable. The world did not end. The sky did not fall. The sun continued its slow arc overhead. Behind her, the smokehouse stood quiet, holding its secrets just as it always had. Only this time, the story inside it had changed. The smoke did not rush. It never did. It moved with a patience that felt deliberate, as if it understood exactly what it was meant to do and had no need to hurry. Betsy watched it curl upward in thin gray threads, drifting lazily before slipping through the narrow cracks in the smokehouse walls. The building seemed to accept it without resistance, drawing it inward the way lungs draw breath. That sight alone was enough to make her throat tighten. She forced herself to keep her eyes open. Inside, the overseer was coughing now, harsh, broken sounds that scraped against the wood and returned to her distorted. The coughing came in waves, violent bursts, followed by strained attempts to breathe. Each sound struck something deep in her memory, pulling loose moments she had buried carefully, deliberately over years. She remembered the heat first, not the warmth of sun on skin, but the suffocating closeness of fire in a confined space. Heat that pressed in from all sides, leaving nowhere to retreat. Heat that made thoughts slippery and panic sharp. As smoke thickened around her now, even outside the building, her skin prickled as if the past had reached forward to touch her. Betsy shifted her weight and steadied herself. She focused on small things, the way the dirt felt beneath her feet, the rough grain of the crate she leaned against, the rhythm of her own breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, controlled. This smoke was not the same. She repeated that truth silently, like a promise she could trust. The coughing inside turned into shouting again, but it was different now. Less force, more desperation. Words blurred together, losing their sharp edges. Commands gave way to pleading. Betsy listened without moving, her face calm, her body still. Smoke thickened, the smell growing heavier, clinging to her clothes, her hair, her skin. It was the same smell she had carried away from this place years ago, embedded so deeply that she had sometimes imagined others could sense it on her. Now it surrounded her again, but the balance had shifted. The smoke no longer owned her breath. Memory crept in regardless. She remembered the way her lungs had burned, each inhale a betrayal because it brought pain with it. She remembered the confusion, the helplessness, the frantic need for air that could not be satisfied. She remembered thinking dimly that this was how she would die, unseen, unheard, reduced to nothing more than a problem disposed of quietly. The sound of coughing snapped her back to the present. She opened her eyes wider, grounding herself in now. The fire crackled softly, steady and controlled. She had built it that way on purpose. Too much fire would draw attention. Too little would fail its task. Balance mattered. Inside, the overseer staggered. She could hear it in the uneven rhythm of movement, the scrape of boots against the floor, the dull thud as he collided with something unseen. He was disoriented now, trapped in darkness thick with smoke. Betsy pictured it clearly without meaning to, his hands grasping at walls, his mouth opening wide for air that would not come. For a fleeting moment, something like pity brushed against her. It surprised her, startled her with its suddenness. She examined it carefully, the way she examined everything that rose up inside her. It was not mercy. Mercy would have required action. This was something else, a recognition, perhaps, of shared humanity in suffering. She let it pass. Suffering did not erase what had been done. It did not undo scars or return stolen years. Pity was a luxury she could not afford, not now, not ever. She turned her attention back to the smoke, adjusting the fire just enough to keep it steady. The coughing became hoarse, wet, punctuated by gasps that grew farther apart. Betsy felt each one like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward into her chest. Her heart beat harder now, not from fear, but from the weight of witnessing. This was not easy. She had never believed it would be. Time lost its shape. Minutes stretched, folded in on themselves. Betsy found herself slipping between past and present without warning. One moment she was sitting outside the smokehouse, watching gray tendrils rise. The next, she was inside again, younger, smaller, struggling to stay conscious as smoke filled her lungs. She squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her fingers into her palms until her nails bit into skin. The sharp sting pulled her back. She was here. She was outside. She was breathing freely. The sounds inside weakened further. The pounding on the door had stopped entirely. Only coughing remained, faint and irregular, followed by long stretches of silence that made her ears strain. Silence inside a place meant for pain was never truly silent. It hummed with memory. Betsy wondered distantly, If this was how it always felt from the outside. If those who had locked her in here had sat somewhere nearby, listening without listening, waiting without waiting, the thought chilled her more than the smoke ever could. She shifted again, standing now, unable to remain seated. Her legs felt restless, energy coiled tight beneath her skin. She paced a small circle, careful to keep her movements slow, deliberate. Panic was contagious. She would not let it infect her. Inside, the overseer spoke again, but his voice was barely recognizable. Words tangled together, slurred and broken. He called names she could not make out. He called promises again, but they dissolved into coughing before they could land. Betsy leaned against the wall of the smokehouse, the rough wood warm beneath her shoulder. She closed her eyes and let herself remember one specific moment from long ago, the instant when the door had closed behind her, sealing her inside. She remembered the finality of that sound, the way it had carved itself into her memory. This time, she was on the other side of the door. The realization did not bring joy. It brought stillness. A deep, quiet stillness that spread through her chest and settled there, heavy but steady. This was not revenge. Revenge was loud, burning, hungry. This was something colder, more deliberate. This was balance being restored in a world that had long denied it. The coughing stopped. At first, Betsy did not trust the silence. Silence could be a trick. It could be a pause before renewed violence, before a final outburst. She remained where she was, listening closely, counting her breaths. 1, 2, 3, nothing. The fire crackled softly. Smoke continued to rise, thinner now, drifting away on the breeze. Somewhere in the distance a bird called. Life went on, indifferent. Betsy waited. As the silence stretched, her thoughts wandered again unbidden. She thought of the others in the fields, bent over their work, unaware. She thought of how many had passed through the smokehouse in fear, how many stories its walls had absorbed. She wondered if buildings remembered, if wood and iron carried echoes the way flesh did. If they did, then this place would never forget today. Her hands trembled slightly when she finally noticed them. The tremor surprised her. She held them out in front of her, watching the faint shake, and felt something loosen inside her. She had held herself rigid for so long, years of restraint compressed into this moment. Now that the act was nearly complete, her body was releasing what it had stored. She clenched her fists until the shaking eased. Control returned slowly, familiar and welcome. The air felt clearer now, less oppressive. Smoke thinned, drifting higher, dissipating. Betsy took a deep breath and held it for a count of 5 before releasing it. The breath tasted of ash and something else, something final. She did not approach the door. She did not test the latch. That door had been closed with purpose, and it would remain so. Opening it would not change what had already happened. It would only change her. She stepped back, putting distance between herself and the smokehouse. Each step felt deliberate, grounded. The pull of the past loosened its grip as she moved away, though it did not disappear entirely and never would. As she walked, she felt the ache along her back, the scars tightening slightly with the change in posture. The sensation was familiar, almost comforting in its constancy. They were still there. They always would be. But for the first time, they did not feel like a sentence. They felt like a record, one that had finally been answered. She stopped once more and looked back at the smokehouse. It stood unchanged, quiet and unremarkable, blending into the landscape as it always had. No sign marked what it had witnessed. No voice announced what had occurred within its walls. That was fitting, she thought. Pain like this was never announced. It was always hidden, always absorbed quietly by places no one wanted to look at too closely. Betsy turned away. The smoke thinned behind her, carried off by the wind, dispersing into the open sky. The fire would burn itself out soon enough. What remained would be ash and silence and a memory the world would never fully know, but which would live on all the same. Night did not fall all at once. It arrived in layers, settling gently over the land as if nothing of consequence had happened, as if the world had not shifted on its axis in some small, invisible way. The sky deepened from pale blue to bruised purple. then to a thick, star-pricked black. Crickets began their chorus unbothered by smoke or silenced by doors closed or breaths stolen. Betsy remained where she was long after the last sound from the smokehouse had faded, long after the fire had settled into glowing embers. She sat on the ground, knees drawn up, arms wrapped loosely around them. The earth beneath her was still warm from the day's heat, and she pressed her palms into it, grounding herself in something solid and unquestionable. Her body felt strangely light, as though some internal weight had been lifted, even as exhaustion crept in, heavy and insistent. It was not the exhaustion of labor she knew so well, but a deeper fatigue, the kind that followed long-held tension finally released. Silence stretched around her, wide and uneven. It was not peaceful. It was alert, listening. Betsy listened too. She listened for footsteps, for voices carried on the wind, for any sign that the world had noticed what had occurred. Nothing came. The plantation slept, unaware or unwilling to wake. She leaned back slightly and tilted her head upward, eyes tracing the scattered stars. She had counted them often as a child, lying on her back outside the quarters, imagining each one as a place she might go someday. She no longer counted. Numbers felt too small now. Still she looked, letting the vastness remind her how small this place truly was, how temporary even its cruelties might be in the long sweep of time. The night air cooled her skin, brushing gently over her arms, her neck, the scars that mapped her back. Those scars seemed to ache more sharply now, as if stirred awake by memory and smoke. She welcomed the sensation. Pain that could be felt meant she was still here. Pain that could be named meant it did not own her completely. From time to time her thoughts drifted back to the smokehouse despite her efforts. She pictured it standing dark and still, its secrets locked away behind thick wood. She wondered if the silence inside was absolute, or if it still echoed faintly with what had passed. The thought made her chest tighten, not with regret, but with something like solemn recognition. Some acts could not be undone, and some moments marked a person forever. This was one of them. Betsy did not cry. Tears hovered at the edges, but they did not fall. She had cried enough in her life to understand their limits. Tears did not bring back what was lost. They did not soften punishment or change the shape of the world. Instead, she breathed, slow and deliberate, counting each inhale and exhale until her pulse steadied again. As the night deepened, sounds shifted subtly. The insects grew louder, then quieter, adjusting their rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its low cry echoing briefly before fading. Betsy closed her eyes and listened, letting the familiar sounds anchor her in the present. Night had always been her refuge. Under its cover, thoughts moved more freely, less constrained by the watchful eyes of day. She thought of the others scattered across the quarters, sleeping or lying awake as she often did. She wondered if any of them sensed the change in the air, the faint residue of smoke carried farther than it appeared. She wondered if they would notice anything different in the morning, a subtle absence that could not be immediately explained. The thought brought a tightness to her chest, not fear, exactly, but anticipation sharpened by uncertainty. Betsy understood that this night was only a pause, not an ending. Consequences would come. They always did. The world she lived in was not forgiving, and it was not blind. She would face questions, suspicion, perhaps worse. She did not fool herself into thinking otherwise, but that knowledge did not undo what she had done. It simply shaped how she would meet what came next. She shifted her position, stretching her legs out in front of her, flexing her toes in the dirt. Her muscles protested, stiff from the day's work and the strain of the evening. She welcomed the ache. It reminded her of her body's resilience, of its capacity to endure more than anyone had ever believed. For a moment she imagined standing up and walking away from the plantation entirely, slipping into the darkness and never looking back. The idea flared briefly, bright and tempting. She pictured the trees swallowing her, the road disappearing behind her, the future opening wide and unknown. But the image faded as quickly as it came. Escape required preparation, allies, timing. Recklessness would only shorten the distance she could go. Instead, she remained where she was, present and watchful. This night was not for running. It was for bearing witness to herself, if no one else. The hours crept by. Betsy could not have said how many passed. Time behaved strangely now, stretching and compressing without warning. She dozed briefly, waking at the slightest shift in sound, her body still trained to vigilance. Each time she woke, she reoriented herself quickly, checking her surroundings, listening. Each time, the world remained unchanged. At some point, clouds drifted across the sky, dimming the stars. The air grew cooler still, and Betsy pulled her arms closer around herself. She felt the chill seep into her bones, settling there alongside fatigue. Yet beneath it all, a steady warmth remained, something internal, something she had not felt before in quite this way. It was not comfort, it was certainty. She thought again of justice, of the word itself and all it implied. Justice, as she had known it, was distant and abstract, spoken by those who never needed it and denied to those who did. Tonight, she had not claimed justice in the way the world defined it. She had claimed balance, consequence, an answer to a debt that had gone unpaid for too long. That knowledge did not absolve her. She did not seek absolution. It simply existed, solid and unyielding, alongside everything else she carried. As the night wore on, Betsy stood at last, her joints stiff but responsive. She brushed dirt from her dress, smoothing the fabric automatically. Habit guided her movements even now. She took one last look toward the smokehouse, barely visible in the darkness, then turned away for good. The walk back toward the quarters felt different from any she had taken before. Each step seemed louder, more deliberate, though she knew she moved quietly. The path was familiar, etched into her muscles by years of repetition, yet tonight it felt altered, as though the ground itself recognized the weight of what she carried. She paused once more before entering the shadowed line of cabins, listening. All was still. Satisfied, she slipped inside her own small space and eased the door shut behind her. The darkness there was complete, comforting in its privacy. She leaned back against the door for a moment, forehead resting against the rough wood, and closed her eyes. Her breath came slow and deep now, exhaustion finally claiming its due. She sank down onto her pallet and lay there, staring up into the darkness. Sleep hovered close, heavy and insistent, but she did not rush toward it. She allowed herself one final moment of awareness, one final acknowledgement of the night that had passed. Tomorrow would bring questions, tomorrow would bring consequences, whispers, fear, but tonight belonged to her alone, and in that quiet ownership she found a strength she had never known she possessed. When sleep finally claimed her, it was not peaceful, but it was deep, and for the first time in as long as she could remember. The smokehouse did not follow her into her dreams.